Welcome, Ambroise. It's great to see you here.
Thank you very much, Sari, and looking forward to catching up with you.
Yes, fantastic. So you have a great background in Silicon Valley and deep tech startup experience. I know you from Nestwave, but I know you've had many other startups. And what we're going to talk about today is what does it take to become a successful startup and how do you actually manage from startup to scale up? But first, I'd really like to hear what you're busy with today.
As you know, we did some work together at a company called Nestwave, which was a startup in France where I was the CEO. And we were developing a very interesting low-power geolocation technology for all kinds of applications. And the company was sold end of 2022 to NexNav, a very interesting American company. So I stayed on board for about 2 years after the acquisition. And so I recently left NexNav, and I'm currently working as both a board member for some companies as well as advisor to startups. And so the main position that I'm occupying right now is executive chairman of EPs, a company in Belgium that develops solutions for energy harvesting, which means typically gathering existing ambient energy to power devices, for example, TV remote controls using small solar panels. In addition to that, I'm advising startups around, fundraising strategies, product roadmap, and business development in deep tech space, so mostly semiconductors, hardware, as well as artificial intelligence.
Tell me a little bit about your experience. What does it take to be a successful startup, really?
So first of all, I don't want to be arrogant to the point of thinking that I know the recipe. I think, I've been fortunate to be in several environments, some good exits, and I've seen small startups like Nestwave, where I was the CEO. When I joined, we were about 6 or 7, and then we grew to about 20 people, so it was a relatively small environment. But previously, I was at a company called Quantenna in the US, which was about 250 people when I joined, and the company went to IPO, so relatively large startup. And 2 years later, it was 400 people and got sold for over $1 billion. So that was really, I think, a very good example of a successful scale up. And so I learned a lot from that experience. So I would say that obviously there's a product aspect where you need to find what people call the product market fit. It's kind of obvious, but it's important to reinforce that I think the first step for a company is to focus on one very specific product offering that meets a market need. And often what I see happening in deep tech companies is often the founders are very technical. They've invented a new technology and tend to be, I would say, in love with that technology a little bit too much and not enough with the market needs. So it often takes a combination of, a great technology, but sometimes you need different people that can bring in as well the understanding of what the market needs. And I think a lot of successful startups that move to scale up is when you have this kind of meeting of the minds between the technology, which is often the technology founder, and more the business view, which can be, somebody from the outside or another co-founder with more of a business view. So I think it's really having for the technology founders the understanding that they may need help to understand that market. And when you have that kind of attitude, I think it can be extremely successful.
But that's quite a condition because, as you and I both know, usually the founders of these really deep tech startups are not very willing to ask for help. So what are you looking for in the founder? Because I'm guessing you scan, who could I work with or who couldn't I work with in that?
So I think, there's a fundamental attitude and character that is needed to be open to, third-party suggestions. And I think, people can evolve as well. It's not like set in stone that, you are this way or the other way. It can take some time through, coaching or through various experiences for these founders to realize and accept, the need for some external help on some of these topics. And I was fortunate on my side to work with some, really great founders, and it's something that I enjoy doing. It also means for the person who is more, let's say, on the business side, to also be humble and accept to learn from those, more technical founders, what they can bring, and they often have extremely good ideas about the market, but it's sometimes more a matter of, having the experience and the structure of analysis needed to really make sure that you can identify the proper market.
So let's say you have a startup with a beautiful product market potential. What do you and a founder who is willing to learn? That's already something. So what else do you look for to make a startup successful?
I would say that's really the prerequisite, the first one, which is, a founding team and this great technology. Then I think, besides the technology aspects, which I don't think is the object of the discussion here, is also a matter of being able to scale the organization in the proper way. So that means attracting talent first at the executive level of a startup, and you have to not go too fast, but not go too slowly, in the sense that if you bring in, for instance, a very senior head of sales in your company before you have a product, well, sometimes it might not work out because that person may be overdimensioned and then leave after a while because there's nothing to sell yet. But at the same time, I see oftentimes people don't realize that you need that super head of sales once you have that product, because initially maybe the small initial team can do those sales, but to really scale, you will need that. And other aspects are often neglected, like creating a culture for the team, an environment where, people want to be working. Obviously, talent is, the most important thing in a company besides, the technology in those startups. So it's not just the executive team, it's, all the engineers that you have, all the supporting staff. Like the first 10 hires that you have, I think are going to be defining if a company is going to be successful or not. So you have to be very careful about that. And that also is not, always easy, I would say, for founders. They may not have that experience of doing that, but it's very important to create that environment and to attract the proper talent in the early days. So I would say that's the second factor of success that I see.
Recruitment is very important then. And you talk about culture, but it's something we talk about a lot in our change profession. But how do you actually create a winning culture? It depends on people, I'm hearing that, but is there any other secret you've got to share?
I don't believe there is like a unique secret here. I think it's a combination of factors, and every company is different. It could happen differently. But I would say that the most important for me is to be aware that the way you behave, what you say, your attitude creates that culture kind of de facto. So you have to be, careful about that, meaning if you show like, respect to others, to new ideas, or if you are like imposing your ideas, then you're creating a culture immediately around consensus or around just, kind of top-down decisions, and then may be difficult to change that later on. The way that you work, if you are like, I don't know, always on time for meetings and organized with agendas and stuff like that, people are going to follow that. If you're very disorganized, which can actually work well in some environments, it's good to be disorganized if it brings creativity and other things, then, it also creates a culture. And I think it happens very quickly in the early days of the company. Now, it can happen that a new senior hire comes in and is able to change that culture, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult once that culture is defined, and it has to be adapted to the market that you go into. It's if you're developing something medical, it's going to take time, and you have to be very thorough about everything. Or something goes into space. If you're developing an app or a game, maybe you have to be. You need kind of different environments, so you need that to be adapted.
So what I'm hearing is really it's your everyday modeling of behavior that sets the culture, especially at the top.
Yes, and I do think that, things start at the top and people observe. I think it's somehow you can make an analogy even to like parenting, where, people say that children will pick up from their parents, not what you say, but how you act. I think it's the same thing in a company, although it's extremely different. But the similarity is that the employees will see and pick up from the founders and the management how things work in that company and act accordingly.
I agree. Yeah, I've seen it happen time and again. So what's been your greatest challenge in this field, creating startups into scale up? So what has been a
Yep.
difficult path for you?
So I think one challenge is when you're in a very small team at first, people will have like very wide areas of responsibility. And comes a time where, as I mentioned, you have to hire some senior people and you're going to split roles and people are going to, on paper, have a smaller perimeter. And that could be difficult. For instance, typically a technical co-founder will be in charge of, let's say, all the technical development, including kind of forward-looking scientific advance, if I'm talking about deep tech, as well as concrete implementation. And I think it's quite useful at one point in time to split things between, let's say, a really engineering organization managing kind of, operations and delivery, and the more forward-looking, more creative part of the technical side. So, for instance, at Nestwave, we made the split where we hired a senior engineering leader, and I think that brought a lot of value to the company. But at first, it was not always easy to make that split. And, the same way I've seen in different organization where you have like a business person at first who does sales, marketing, business development, all of that. And then there comes a time where you need to focus and you're going to say, well, no, you're just going to be doing marketing and this other person is just going to be doing sales. So at first, people may resent that and say, well, no, I want to be in charge of all of it. But
Yeah.
in many cases, it's best for people to be focusing on a smaller part. And, building that great organization is going to require some of those changes. And it's also possible that someone who is great for the first few years of a company doesn't fit in the organization after that. And you have to let them go or they have to go on their own. And those are very difficult things to do when you're in charge. But that's the condition for a startup to grow, to scale up. It takes different people. So sometimes the early people grow, and often that works, especially the founders, but sometimes you just have to make those changes, and it's difficult.
Yeah, the founder is not always the best manager. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah. But there was this debate recently in Silicon Valley about, what is called, let's say, the founder mode, as opposed to kind of people coming from the outside, and people arguing that you have to trust the founders a lot because, they know the company, even if they don't have the experience of management. So I think, it's extremely important for founders to stay involved as much as possible in the company, even if they don't have all of that experience, because they have the initial idea, the initial values of a company.
Vision.
And
Yeah.
I've seen examples, for instance, this company, Quantenna, I mentioned where I was in the US, where I joined just before the IPO of grew. I know that some of the founders in the early days, there were challenges between the founders and the investors, and, they left. And then the company brought in external talent who brought the company to success. So in that case, the company was able to succeed without the founders, but I think it's an exception. I think it's very tough if the founders are not growing and staying involved for a long time in the company. It's going to be difficult. So I was thinking more about some of the initial hires that you make, not the founders. Some of these may be great for a couple of years, and then maybe you need others. But it is true that the founders sometimes are not well adapted and may need to take a different role or even leave. But I think it's a big loss when that happens, and it's more difficult for the companies, but it can work in some cases.
Yeah, it's kind of the soul of the company, yeah, the
It's
founder.
kind of a soul of a company, as you say, and also usually they own a lot of the shares of a company, so it can create issues if you start losing them in an operational
Mhm.
capacity.
So, last question. You've been through so much in your career around startups and scale ups and deep tech. If someone would start a company now, what kind of advice would you give them?
I don't think I have any secret recipe, but I would say it's important to make sure you're passionate about the topic they're going to be working on because you're going to be giving it a lot of time and energy. Second is, as I mentioned earlier, try and focus not just on your technology, but really on making sure that there is a market need for your innovation that you have. And third is I think it's very important to have a good founder team, not just one person, but make sure you have at least one co-founder.
Yeah.
I think three is a great number. It works often quite well because you create like those different dynamics and make sure that not only you can work well with these people, but you have some kind of personal value fit with them as well, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them. It's not just about work, it's about, personal relationships. And that is as well, I think, what is going to create the successful culture of a company is some personal bonding. Doesn't mean that you have to be best friends or share the same political views or hobbies or whatever, but there needs to be some amount of personal chemistry between those founders, and I think that will be extremely important to the success of a company, even beyond that technology and stuff like that.
Thank you, Ambroise, for your wisdom.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for your time, Sari.